The case of Krishna Maharaj did not unfold in Port of Spain, Kingston, or Georgetown. It played out in Miami, Florida, thousands of miles from the Caribbean. And yet it belongs here, in Caribbean files. Maharaj was a son of Trinidad and Tobago, a man who embodied the drive, resilience, and ambition of the Caribbean diaspora. His rise from modest beginnings to millionaire businessman was remarkable. But his fall, caught in the gears of a foreign justice system, revealed something darker. His ordeal showed how Caribbean people, when far from home, can be trapped by prejudice, indifference, and corruption.
When they found me guilty, I passed out. I fainted. I just couldn't believe you could be found guilty for something you didn't do. Murder.
That is why this story matters, because an injustice against one of us ripples across all of us. The Caribbean is more than geography, it is a people spread across continents, bound by shared struggle and unbreakable ties. Krishna Maharaj's long fight for freedom ended inside a Florida prison hospital. But his story did not die there. It survives as a warning, a lesson, and a call that truth must matter, that justice must mean something, and that we, wherever we are, must remain vigilant. In order to understand the case of Krishna Maharaj, a Caribbean businessman who has spent nearly 4 decades behind bars for a crime that mounting evidence suggests he did not commit, we first need to step back into Miami during the 1980s. This was not the Miami of pastel colored postcards and vacation brochures. This was the Miami of the so called cocaine cowboys era, a city awash in narco dollars, where cash and cocaine flowed in equal measure. By 1985, U.S. federal agencies estimated that more than 70% of America's cocaine supply passed through Miami. The Medellin cartel under Pablo Escobar was at the height of its power, flooding the city with drugs and laundering billions through seemingly legitimate banks and businesses. The violence was relentless. The Miami Herald recorded more than 600 drug related murders in 1981 alone, most carried out in broad daylight, often in public spaces meant to send a message. For ordinary citizens, and for immigrant business people trying to build lives in this volatile environment, Miami was a city where prosperity and danger lived side by side. It is against this backdrop that we meet Chris Maharaj, a man whose story begins far from the blood soaked streets of Florida. Krishna Maharaj was born in 1939 in Trinidad, part of a large Indian Caribbean family. In his 20s, he migrated to the United Kingdom, where he built an unlikely but remarkable fortune. Starting from small scale ventures, Maharaj eventually established himself as a businessman, importing fruits, vegetables, and later expanding into publishing and racehorse ownership. By the 1970s, he was a self made millionaire, a member of London's Caribbean diaspora whose success was celebrated within immigrant circles. To acquaintances, he was charismatic, ambitious, sometimes hot tempered, but undeniably successful. By the early 1980s, he had homes in the UK and Florida and was seeking to expand his interests into Miami's booming business scene. It was here, through connections in publishing, that Maharaj became acquainted with Derek and Dwayne Moo Young, a wealthy father and son pair originally from Jamaica who appeared to be high flying businessmen with deep connections across the Caribbean. The Moo Youngs presented themselves as sophisticated investors, men who could turn profits through property deals, publishing ventures, and cross border business. In truth, as later evidence would reveal, they were at the center of one of the most dangerous financial networks in the Americas, laundering billions in cartel money. But in 1986, Maharaj's association with the Moo Youngs seemed routine. Business meetings, publishing negotiations, investments, nothing that hinted at the storm about to come. The DuPont Plaza Hotel in downtown Miami was one of the city's landmarks, a business hub where international investors, bankers, and deal makers converged. On October 16th, 1986, it also became the site of one of Miami's most notorious double homicides. That afternoon, the Moo Youngs were lured to room 1215 on the 12th floor. The room had been rented earlier by Maharaj under his own name, reportedly to hold a meeting regarding outstanding financial disputes. Accounts vary on the exact sequence of events, but what is certain is this. Inside room 1215, both Derek and Dwayne Moo Young were shot execution style. The crime scene was brutal and deliberate. Derek was shot multiple times. His son Dwayne was executed with 2 bullets to the head. The precision of the killings bore the hallmarks of a professional hit: quick, efficient, merciless. Witnesses later described hearing nothing until the bodies were discovered. Within hours, police zeroed in on one suspect, Krishna Maharaj. A key figure in the state's case would be Neville Butler, a Trinidadian associate of Maharaj. Butler claimed that Maharaj had asked him to arrange a meeting with the Moo Youngs that day and that he personally escorted them to room 1215. Butler testified that once inside the room, Maharaj emerged with a gun, ordered the Moo Youngs to sit, and interrogated them over missing funds. According to Butler, Maharaj accused the Moo Youngs of cheating him out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The confrontation, Butler said, escalated until shots rang out, leaving both father and son dead. This dramatic testimony would become the backbone of the prosecution's case. Yet, even at the time, questions lingered. Why would a wealthy businessman, with no history of violent crime, brazenly execute 2 men in a hotel room booked in his own name? Why would Butler's version of events, inconsistent and uncorroborated, be taken as gospel in such a high stakes murder trial? These doubts, however, would be largely swept aside in the climate of Miami's 1980s drug war hysteria, where swift convictions mattered more than nuanced truths. Later that evening, police arranged to meet Maharaj at a Denny's restaurant under the pretense of resolving the financial dispute. When he arrived, expecting a business meeting, he was instead ambushed and arrested. To police, it looked like an open and shut case: a Caribbean millionaire, angry over money, luring 2 business partners into a hotel room and killing them in cold blood. Maharaj insisted on his innocence from the start. He admitted to renting the room, yes, but denied being present when the murders occurred. He claimed he had intended a meeting with the Moo Youngs, but had left before they ever arrived. For him, it was inconceivable that authorities would truly believe he had orchestrated such a reckless crime in such a public, traceable fashion. But for the Miami police and prosecutors, Krishna Maharaj was now their man. The murders of Derek and Dwayne Moo Young shocked both Miami and the wider Caribbean diaspora. Newspapers across Florida, the UK, and the Caribbean splashed headlines about the case. Here was a Trinidad-born millionaire, once celebrated as a rags to riches immigrant success story, now accused of one of Miami's most notorious killings. From the beginning, there were fractures in the case. There was no murder weapon tied to Maharaj, no physical evidence directly linking him to the crime scene at the time of the killings. The state's narrative rested almost entirely on Neville Butler's testimony that would later collapse under scrutiny. Yet, in the feverish atmosphere of 1980s Miami, nuance mattered little. Prosecutors painted Maharaj as a ruthless businessman who solved disputes with bullets. The defense, underfunded and unprepared, would struggle to mount an effective counter. When the trial of Krishna Maharaj began in 1987, Miami was still in the throes of cartel-fueled violence. Federal officials were desperate to show that justice could be delivered swiftly, that violent crime would not go unpunished. But in their rush to secure convictions, safeguards that should have guaranteed fairness were eroded. The state presented Maharaj as a wealthy Caribbean businessman who had finally snapped. Their theory was straightforward. Maharaj accused the Moo Youngs of cheating him out of large sums of money, lured them to the DuPont Plaza Hotel, and killed them in cold blood. It was a clean story, easily digestible to a jury. The reality, however, was anything but clean. The prosecution leaned heavily on the testimony of Neville Butler, the state's star witness. Butler's account placed Maharaj in the hotel room, gun in hand, accusing and then executing the Moo Youngs. Butler claimed he narrowly escaped himself, spared only because he was an intermediary. But there were glaring issues. Butler's story had changed multiple times during pretrial statements. His timeline contradicted other evidence, and most critically, no independent witnesses corroborated his claims. The state also produced financial documents and business records meant to show tension between Maharaj and the Moo Youngs. Prosecutors alleged that Maharaj had invested hundreds of thousands in deals with them and suspected he was being defrauded. While disputes existed, there was no smoking gun, no direct evidence that these disagreements escalated to murder. Perhaps most troubling, forensic evidence from the crime scene did not tie Maharaj to the killings. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon recovered that could be linked to him. Despite this, prosecutors doubled down on Butler's testimony, telling the jury that Maharaj's guilt was obvious. On the other side, Maharaj's defense was plagued by limitations. His attorneys lacked resources, struggled with investigation, and were frequently blindsided by late disclosure of evidence. Key witnesses who might have provided an alibi were never called. For example, Maharaj consistently maintained that at the time of the murders, he had been at another location preparing for a business meeting. Records and individuals who could have corroborated this were left untapped. Even more troubling, evidence favorable to the defense was not disclosed by the prosecution. This included leads suggesting the Moo Youngs were laundering money for Colombian drug cartels, a detail that cast the murders in an entirely different light. If the Moo Youngs were tied to cartel finances, their execution could easily have been the work of professional hitmen. Yet the jury never heard this possibility. Instead, the trial unfolded as a one-dimensional story: a millionaire with a grudge, a gun, and a deadly temper. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on all counts. Krishna Maharaj was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and other charges. The courtroom, packed with reporters and spectators, fell silent as the verdict was read. Maharaj, who had expected at least some recognition of the holes in the state's case, was stunned. To him, it felt like a foregone conclusion that the trial had been more performance than pursuit of truth. The judge wasted little time in imposing one of the harshest penalties available: death by electric chair. For a man who had built a fortune through decades of hard work, who had once been celebrated as a Caribbean success story, it was a devastating reversal of fortune. Overnight, Maharaj went from respected businessman to convicted murderer facing execution. Almost immediately, the case drew attention from legal observers and human rights organizations. The conviction seemed fragile, built on inconsistent testimony and missing evidence. Appeals were filed, arguing prosecutorial misconduct, ineffective defense, and constitutional violations. But appeals courts are not designed to retry cases. They focus narrowly on procedure, not on re-examining facts. Despite compelling claims, most appeals were denied. In 1997, a federal appeals panel upheld the conviction, keeping Maharaj on Florida's death row. For more than a decade, Maharaj lived under the shadow of execution. His days were spent in the isolation of a death row cell, a stark existence of steel bars, concrete walls, and the constant reminder that the state intended to kill him. Looking back, legal experts point to Maharaj's trial as a textbook example of systemic failure. Key exculpatory evidence was withheld. Defense counsel was ineffective and underfunded. Witness testimony was contradictory and unreliable. The broader context, cartel violence and money laundering, was ignored. Yet in the 1980s climate of Miami, When drug wars dominated headlines and public trust in institutions was crumbling, Maharaj's conviction was politically convenient. Authorities could claim they had delivered justice, even if the truth was sacrificed in the process. In 2002, after years of legal wrangling, a small victory arrived. A U.S. federal judge overturned Maharaj's death sentence, citing concerns about the fairness of his trial. However, the conviction itself was not vacated. Instead, Maharaj's sentence was commuted from death to life imprisonment. For Maharaj, then in his early 60s, the change was bittersweet. He was no longer under threat of immediate execution, but he remained condemned to spend the rest of his life in prison for crimes he maintained he did not commit. By the early 2000s, Krishna Maharaj had already spent more than 15 years behind bars, his reputation destroyed, his fortune gone. From his prison cell, he continued to insist on his innocence, writing letters, appealing to courts, and seeking help from anyone willing to listen. And slowly, cracks began to widen in the state's narrative. New witnesses emerged. Evidence long buried began to surface. The picture that had been painted in 1987 of a millionaire businessman turned murderer began to unravel. What it revealed was far darker, implicating not just a flawed trial, but the possibility that the Mu Young murders were cartel executions and that the wrong man had been imprisoned for nearly 4 decades. The question was no longer whether Maharaj was guilty, but how such a miscarriage of justice could have been allowed to stand. By the early 2000s, Krishna Maharaj had spent more than a decade in prison, still proclaiming his innocence. For many, his case had faded into obscurity, eclipsed by new waves of Miami crime stories. But within the quiet persistence of his appeals, revelations began to surface, ones that reshaped the Mu Young murders from a supposed business dispute into what appeared to be a classic cartel hit. Even at the time of the murders, rumors swirled about the Mu Young family's business dealings. Financial documents suggested irregularities. Whisper networks in Miami and Kingston pointed to laundering schemes, with the Mu Youngs acting as financial intermediaries for Colombian cartels. Years later, through investigative work by Maharaj's legal team, those whispers hardened into evidence. Declassified FBI reports, U.S. government intelligence cables, and testimonies from cartel insiders all pointed to one conclusion. The Mu Youngs were laundering tens of millions of dollars for the Medellin cartel, led by Pablo Escobar himself. In fact, according to cartel witnesses, the Mu Youngs were entrusted with funds that went missing. In the world of narco finance, such losses were never tolerated. For Escobar's network, betrayal meant death. This revelation reframed the entire case. If the Mu Youngs were cartel accountants, their killings at the DuPont Plaza had the unmistakable fingerprints of an execution order. And if so, why would the state of Florida pin the murders on an aging businessman with no cartel ties? In the years following Maharaj's death sentence being commuted to life, his lawyers, led by British human rights attorney Clive Stafford Smith, began tracking down individuals tied to Escobar's cartel. One by one, witnesses came forward with chilling accounts. A former Escobar hitman testified under oath that he and others had been involved in the Mu Young murders. According to his testimony, the order had come directly from Escobar's lieutenants after the Mu Youngs mishandled cartel funds. Another witness, a former cartel associate, confirmed that Maharaj had no involvement whatsoever. He was nothing to do with it, the witness reportedly told investigators. Even more damning, evidence emerged that law enforcement officials at the time had suspicions about cartel involvement, but that line of inquiry was quietly abandoned. These testimonies painted a stark picture. Krishna Maharaj was not the orchestrator of the killings, but rather a scapegoat.
When the judge has ruled that Chris is innocent by clear and convincing evidence and that No reasonable juror could convict him. That's not enough to set him free. I mean, this is what drives me rather mad about the case. And, obviously it's much harder for Chris and Marita to deal with.
What made the revelations even more shocking was the discovery that key evidence had been withheld during Maharaj's trial. Court filings later revealed that prosecutors possessed documents pointing to the Mu Young's ties to money laundering. They also had access to leads that connected the murders to known cartel operatives. None of this was disclosed to the defense. In legal terms, this constituted a Brady violation, the withholding of evidence favorable to the defendant. In moral terms, it meant a man had been sent to death row while the true killers walked free. Armed with this new evidence, Maharaj's defense launched a fresh legal campaign. They argued that his conviction was a miscarriage of justice built on unreliable testimony and the deliberate suppression of evidence. But the fight was uphill. Courts remained reluctant to overturn a decades-old conviction, even in the face of mounting proof. Technicalities, statutes of limitation, and procedural hurdles all worked against Maharaj. Judges acknowledged problems with the case, but often concluded they were insufficient to void the conviction outright. Meanwhile, Maharaj, now an elderly man in failing health, remained imprisoned, watching the years slip away as the system resisted admitting its mistakes. By the mid-2010s, the case had crossed into international headlines. The British press, outraged that a UK citizen appeared to be rotting in a US prison for crimes he did not commit, amplified the story. Human rights organizations described Maharaj as one of the most glaring examples of wrongful conviction in the Western Hemisphere. Documentaries, op-eds, and parliamentary debates in London echoed a single demand: justice. How could Florida continue to hold a man behind bars when cartel witnesses, government records, and withheld evidence all pointed elsewhere? Even U.S. judges, in written opinions, admitted that Maharaj was likely innocent, but claimed their hands were tied by procedural rules. One federal judge famously remarked that if Maharaj was innocent, the state of Florida may have the wrong man, but legal relief was still denied. For Krishna Maharaj, these developments were bittersweet. On one hand, his claims of innocence were finally validated by external evidence. On the other, the system that had convicted him seemed structurally incapable of correcting itself. Each passing year underscored the cost of delay. Maharaj grew older, frailer, and sicker. His wife, Marita, tirelessly campaigned for his release, standing by him through decades of confinement. Their bond became emblematic of resilience, but also of a tragedy compounded by time. By this stage, the story of Krishna Maharaj was no longer just about one man's conviction. It had become a mirror reflecting the deeper flaws of the American justice system: its vulnerability to misconduct, its rigidity in the face of new evidence, and its willingness to preserve verdicts even when truth pointed in another direction. The question looming was clear: would Krishna Maharaj die in prison despite the overwhelming evidence of his innocence, or would the system finally bend to the truth? For those who followed the case, the answer seemed both urgent and elusive. By the early 2010s, Krishna Maharaj was no longer just a footnote in true crime lore. His case had become an international beacon of legal failure and of resilience. Against nearly 4 decades behind bars, his story captured global attention as the evidence of his innocence stacked up. Multiple cartel insiders, including associates of Pablo Escobar, publicly admitted that the Mu Young murders were ordered hits, not the work of Maharaj. One of Escobar's own hitmen, known as Popeye, even submitted a signed affidavit confirming that Escobar had ordered the killings. These revelations, along with DEA confirmations of cartel-related activity in adjacent hotel rooms on the day of the murders, significantly bolstered the case for Maharaj's innocence. In 2019, Federal Magistrate Judge Alicia M. Otazo Reyes issued a startling ruling. Maharaj had proven his innocence by clear and convincing evidence, and no reasonable juror could convict him. Yet, under U.S. law, proving innocence was not enough. Despite the ruling, Maharaj remained in prison, trapped by legal precedent that does not permit release based solely on innocence. The case galvanized international support. In the UK, over 300 notable figures, including MPs, judges, and legal luminaries, petitioned Florida's governor for a retrial, citing astonishing flaws in the original case. Human rights organizations like Reprieve, led by Clive Stafford Smith, tirelessly advocated for Maharaj, terming it an epic miscarriage of justice. Despite the mounting evidence and lobbying, the U.S. courts upheld the conviction. The Supreme Court refused to intervene, and legal avenues gradually closed for Maharaj's release. In August 2024, after enduring 38 years in U.S. prisons, Krishna Maharaj died at age 85 in a Florida prison hospital. His passing, despite years of evidence pointing to innocence, was met with international mourning and outrage. His wife, Marita Maharaj, had long awaited his release. She had moved back to the UK and hoped he would join her. Instead, she found herself delivering his body to British soil for burial, grieving the life they never had a chance to share in freedom. Clive Stafford Smith vowed to continue the fight. "We'll carry on. I want my revenge on the state of Florida," he declared, committed to posthumously clearing Maharaj's name. Maharaj's final years were marked by declining health. He battled diabetes, heart trouble, kidney disease, and cataracts. Yet he remained keen-eyed and spiritually vigorous, often reciting Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd," as he held on to hope that truth would eventually prevail. For Marita, the fight became a life's mission to secure the three things Krishna always desired: legal vindication, reunion, and burial together in England. She continues to champion his legacy, even as she mourns their unfulfilled future. Maharaj's case transcends the tragic story of one man. It underscores systemic pitfalls: withheld exculpatory evidence, ineffective defense, corrupt authorities, reliance on unreliable witnesses, and an inflexible system that ignores innocence. It arrived too late for Krishna Maharaj, but his story has become a rallying cry for criminal justice reform, post conviction review mechanisms, and the recognition that innocence merits freedom, not just belated accolades. Krishna Maharaj is gone, but his case endures as a stark indictment of injustice and a beacon for change. For Caribbean Files, his story is a powerful narrative of how power, prejudice, and inertia converge to trap an innocent man, and how relentless advocacy can shine a light into the darkest corners of the justice system. At Caribbean Files, we tell these stories not to sensationalize, but to bear witness, to document, to connect, and to demand accountability. If you found this story important, help us keep the spotlight shining. Subscribe to Caribbean Files so you don't miss the next case. Share this video to make sure Maharaj's name and the lessons of his life continue to be heard. And join the conversation. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. What does justice look like to you? Because telling these stories together is how we remember, how we resist, and how we ensure that voices like Krishna Maharaj's are never silenced again.